fog rolled low along Bond Street the morning the old woman was thrown out of Ashworth & Sons jewelers. She wore a cloak the color of ash, patched twice at the hem, her boots worn through at the sole, and her hands trembled as the doorman seized her elbow and steered her toward the street with rather more force than courtesy required. "We do not serve beggars here," the shop manager, Mr. Pruitt, announced, loud enough for the whole street to hear over the clatter of passing carriages. "Be gone before I call the constable and have you charged with vagrancy." Laughter rippled through the assembled clerks, delighted, as clerks so often are, by the misfortune of someone lower than themselves. All but one. A slight young woman in a gray shopgirl's dress stepped forward from behind the counter, her voice steady, though her knees shook beneath her skirts. "Please," she said, "let me help her." Mr. Pruitt turned on her, delighted to have discovered a fresh target for his cruelty. "You'll lose your position for defending a beggar, Miss Whitmore. Mark my words." She knelt anyway, upon the cold marble floor of a shop that sold diamonds she could never have afforded in 3 lifetimes of wages, and offered the old woman her own shawl, and pressed a cup of water into her cracked and trembling hands. 3 days later, a black carriage bearing a ducal crest, a hawk in flight over a field of thistle, stopped before that same shop. A tall man in a greatcoat the color of storm clouds stepped down, walked past the manager without so much as a glance, and asked only one question of the assembled, suddenly silent staff. "Where is the girl who knelt?" If a moment like that has ever stayed with you, the kind that makes your chest ache long after the page is turned, remember to subscribe, so you never miss where this story goes. Eleanor Whitmore had learned early, and learned thoroughly, that kindness was a luxury the poor were rarely permitted to keep. She had been born in a narrow house off Cheapside, the daughter of a clockmaker who died of a fever when she was 11, and a mother who followed him into the churchyard not 18 months later, worn through by grief and want in equal measure. There had been no family willing to take in an orphaned girl with no dowry and no particular prospects, until a neighbor, a woman the whole street called, with a mixture of affection and unease, Nana Adaeze, had opened her narrow door and said simply, "Come in then, child. The night is cold and you are thin as a reed." Nana Adaeze was not, strictly, anyone's grandmother. She was a free, black Englishwoman, well past 60, who had crossed an ocean as a girl, in circumstances she rarely spoke of and never in detail, and had crossed back into freedom through sheer will and the mercy of a Quaker family who had taught her to read. She earned her bread as a seamstress, mending lace for households far grander than her own, and she had raised Eleanor on porridge, patched stockings, and a peculiar kind of unshakable faith. "A closed hand cannot receive a gift," she used to say, working lace by candlelight while Eleanor swept the hearth or darned a stocking beside her. "Guard your kindness as you would guard a flame in the wind, child. The world will try 1,000 times to blow it out. Do not let it. It is the only inheritance I have to leave you, and I promise you it is worth more than any dowry." Eleanor had not understood, as a girl of 12, precisely what such words meant. She understood them rather better at 19, folding velvet ring boxes at Ashworth & Sons for 11 shillings a week, in a shop that smelled of beeswax polish and cold ambition, under a manager who delighted in humiliating anyone smaller than himself, and co-workers who found her strange, too quiet, too watchful, too inclined toward kindness for people who could do nothing whatsoever for her in return. It was not an easy life. The hours were long, the wages thin, and the other shop girls, Sarah and Mary Prentice, and a sharp-tongued girl called Fanny, regarded Eleanor's gentleness less as a virtue than as a peculiar weakness, the sort of thing one grew out of, the way one grew out of childish games. "You'll never rise in this trade being soft," Fanny told her more than once, not unkindly, simply stating what she took to be an obvious fact of the world. "Mr. Pruitt rewards those who flatter the customers with money and forget the rest." Eleanor smiled and said nothing, and continued, quietly, to be exactly what Nana Adaeze had raised her to be. Nana Adaeze had died the previous winter, quite peacefully, in the small bed by the hearth where she had slept for 30 years, and Eleanor had inherited from her precisely 3 things: a wooden pendant carved in the shape of a bird with its wings spread wide, a Bible with pressed flowers between its pages, and a store of proverbs that she carried the way other girls carried lockets, close to the heart, taken out and turned over in private moments, when the world outside seemed determined to prove them wrong. By the gray Tuesday morning this story properly begins, Eleanor had been at Ashworth & Sons for 2 years, had saved 4 shillings toward a winter coat she badly needed, and had no earthly notion that kindness was about to cost her every penny of it, and give her, in exchange, everything else in the world. The old woman entered the shop a little after 11 o'clock, leaning heavily on a plain wooden cane, asking in a soft and halting voice whether anyone might spare a moment to help her read a letter, for her eyes, she said, had grown too dim to make out the smaller print. No one moved. The shop's usual customers were countesses and merchants' wives, who arrived by carriage and left with velvet boxes tucked beneath their arms, and the sudden appearance of a woman in a patched, ash-gray cloak among the glass cases of sapphires and pearls struck the room as something between an intrusion and an amusement. Then the mockery began in earnest, a junior clerk mimicking her trembling hands behind her back, to the sniggering delight of 2 others, Fanny asking loudly whether beggars were now permitted to browse diamonds at Ashworth & Sons, as though the establishment had lowered itself considerably since Tuesday last. Eleanor set down the tray of rings she had been carrying to the display counter and crossed the marble floor, her footsteps sounding, to her own ears, unnaturally loud in the sudden hush that always follows cruelty when it has found its mark. "May I read it for you, ma'am?" The old woman's eyes, pale and clouded as a winter sky before snow, fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed, for one strange moment, entirely at odds with her ragged clothing. "You are not afraid to be seen with me, child?" "I have been where you are standing," Eleanor said simply, and it was true enough. She had known cold rooms and closed doors, and the particular sting of being looked at as though she were furniture rather than a person. "Cruelty remembers no rank, ma'am. I have found it visits rich and poor alike. I see no reason kindness should be more particular." She read the letter aloud in the quiet corner by the window. A note from a solicitor, oddly formal for a woman in patched cloaks, though Eleanor thought little of it at the time, assuming it concerned some small legacy or a parish pension, fetched a cup of water from the back room, despite Mr. Pruitt's pointed glare, and when the old woman confessed, quietly and with evident shame, that she had not eaten since the previous morning, Eleanor did not hesitate. She placed her own week's wages, 4 shillings entire, the coat money, saved penny by penny, against the coming winter, into the old woman's cracked and trembling palm. "Child, I cannot accept this. You have nothing to spare." "I have little," Eleanor said, closing the woman's fingers gently around the coins, "but I would rather give it to you now and go without a new coat this winter than keep it for myself and sleep poorly every night for having refused a hungry woman a meal. My grandmother, she was not my true grandmother, but she raised me all the same, used to say that a gift withheld out of fear does more harm to the giver's soul than the receiver's belly. I believe she was right." The old woman studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression crossing her weathered face, something that might have been grief or wonder or both together, before she pressed Eleanor's hand once, firmly, and said only, "What is your name, child?" "Eleanor Whitmore, ma'am." "Eleanor Whitmore," the woman repeated softly, as though committing it to memory with great care. "I shall not forget it." Mr. Pruitt dismissed Eleanor from her position before the shop door had even fully closed behind her departing guest, informing her, in front of the assembled staff, that Ashworth & Sons could not employ a girl who embarrassed the establishment before its finer customers by consorting with beggars on the shop floor. Eleanor walked home through the rain that night, with empty pockets, no coat to speak of, and no notion whatsoever of where her next week's rent was to come from, and yet, strangely, with a lighter heart than she had known in months. She did not yet know she had just given away her last coins to the Dowager Duchess of Ashmoor. Edward Wexford, 7th Duke of Ashmoor, was a man carved, by circumstance and by choice, from restraint. He had inherited the title at 26 upon the sudden death of his father, and had spent the decade since learning that a dukedom was rather less a privilege than a series of obligations, each one arriving with its own weight and its own silence. He had married, at 28, a woman his father had chosen, for reasons of estate and alliance rather than affection, and had buried her 4 years later, after a long illness, having never once, in all that time, heard her say she loved him, nor found himself able to say it in return. He had, in the years since, run Ashmoor's estates as he ran his own heart, with iron discipline, considerable competence, and very few visitors permitted past either gate. Society considered him, variously, cold, unreadable, and an excellent catch for any ambitious family with a marriageable daughter, none of which observations troubled him overmuch, since he had long since concluded that society's opinions of him mattered rather less than the tenant farms, the tenant families, and the endless correspondence that constituted the actual substance of his days. So it was that when his mother, the Dowager Duchess, returned to Ashmoor Castle one gray afternoon trembling not from cold, but from something closer to wonder, he set aside the ledgers he had been reviewing and gave her, for the first time in some months, his full and undivided attention. "A girl in a shop gave me her last coins today, Edward," she said, still in her traveling cloak, her cane forgotten by the door. "She did not know who I was. I told her nothing of my name, dressed as I was. You know I insisted on the plain cloak, foolish as it may have seemed to Perkins. And she looked at me, Edward, the way one looks at a person, not a purse to be flattered, not a rank to be curtsied to, a person in want of a little kindness, and she gave me everything she had to spare. 'You went unaccompanied into a jeweler's shop dressed as a beggar,' he said, though there was no real reproach in it, only the particular weariness of a son long accustomed to his mother's more eccentric convictions. 'Mother, you might have been robbed, or worse.' 'I might have been,' she agreed, settling into the chair by the fire with the slow care of a woman past 70, and instead I was given water and a shawl, and 4 shillings from a girl who could evidently spare none of it, while every other soul in that shop laughed at my expense. I have been thanked and flattered by a great many people in my life who wanted something from me, Edward. I have not in 40 years been shown kindness by someone who believed I had nothing whatsoever to give in return." He said little that evening, though something in his chest, some long-dormant capacity for surprise he had believed thoroughly buried alongside his father, and later his wife, stirred uneasily. The next morning he sat alone in his study long after his mother had retired, staring at nothing in particular, until at last he sent for the shop's employment ledger under the pretext of a complaint regarding staff conduct, a pretext Mr. Pruitt, terrified of losing so significant a patron as the Duke of Ashmoor, supplied without a single question. He found her name on the second page, beside a notation in a clerk's cramped hand, Eleanor Whitmore, dismissed for insubordination and unsuitable conduct toward customers. He read it 3 times over. He ordered the carriage. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her lodging house 2 days later, quite certain the liveried footman on her step had mistaken the address, until he repeated her name a second time with the particular patience of a man well accustomed to delivering surprising news. "His Grace the Duke of Ashmoor requests your presence at Ashmoor Castle, Miss Whitmore. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, wishes to thank you personally for a kindness you showed her recently." Eleanor's first thought, absurdly, was for her one good dress, hastily brushed and pressed as the carriage, an actual ducal carriage, black lacquer and gleaming brass, the sort of conveyance she had only ever seen from the pavement, waited outside her narrow lodging house on a street that had, she was quite certain, never before hosted such a vehicle. The journey to Ashmoor took the better part of 2 hours, through countryside greening with early spring, past hedgerows and church spires, and, at last, through wrought iron gates opening onto a drive so long and so lined with ancient oaks that Eleanor found herself gripping the edge of her seat, half in awe and half in a rising, unfamiliar dread. The castle itself, when it came into view, seemed to her less a house than a small principality, gray stone towers rising against a sky gone gold with late afternoon light, mullioned windows catching fire in the setting sun, gardens stretching in every direction with a precision that spoke of generations of careful design. She was received, not in some grand public hall, as she had half expected and wholly dreaded, but in the Dowager Duchess's own private chamber, a warm, book-lined room smelling faintly of lavender and old paper, where the elderly woman rose from her chair the moment Eleanor entered and took both her hands in a grip surprisingly strong for one so frail in appearance. "You gave to a stranger what you could not spare, and never once asked what she might give you in return," the Dowager Duchess said, her pale eyes bright with something that might have been unshed tears. "I have not forgotten such kindness in 40 years of being flattered by people who wanted something from me. I should like, if you will permit it, to thank you properly." She offered Eleanor a position, companion to the Duchess herself, with wages tenfold what the shop had paid, and lodging within the castle besides. Eleanor, standing in a room grander than any she had entered in her life, found herself thinking, unbidden, of Nana Adese's voice. A closed hand cannot receive a gift. She opened hers and accepted. It was in the long stone corridor afterward, candlelight flickering against ancient walls hung with the portraits of 6 generations of Ashmoor dukes, that Eleanor first met the current duke's eyes directly, dark, watchful, and entirely unlike what she had expected of a man whose name commanded such fear and deference among his own household staff. He did not smile. She would learn, in the weeks to come, that he rarely did. But he studied her with an attention that felt, oddly, less like scrutiny than like a man attempting to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit the shape he had been told to expect. "You did not know who my mother was," he said. "It was not a question. Would it have mattered, Your Grace, if she had been exactly what she appeared to be, a poor woman with nothing to offer but her thanks?" "No," he said quietly, after a pause long enough that Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped. "It would not have mattered to you in the least. That, Miss Whitmore, is precisely the trouble." She did not understand, that first evening, what trouble a duke could possibly find in a shopgirl's honesty. She would come to understand it very well indeed, in time. The castle's household received her with the particular wariness reserved for outsiders whose place in the domestic order was not immediately clear. She was neither servant nor guest, neither family nor stranger, and for the first fortnight the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, addressed her with a stiff, uncertain courtesy that thawed only gradually as the older woman came to observe, day by day, that Eleanor rose early to help with tasks no companion was required to touch, remembered the names of every scullery maid and stable boy, and never once, in all her dealings, spoke down to those whose position was lower than her own newly elevated one. Her days settled into a rhythm she had not known she was capable of enjoying. Mornings were spent reading to the Dowager Duchess, histories and novels, and occasionally letters from the Duchess's few surviving friends, her eyesight having grown too dim for small print, exactly as it had been that first day in the shop, though she no longer troubled to hide behind a beggar's cloak. Afternoons were her own, largely, to walk the gardens or sit in the vast library, a room with shelves rising 3 stories, and a silence so complete Eleanor sometimes found herself holding her breath merely to preserve it. It was in that library, in her second week at Ashmoor, that she first encountered the Duke at any length beyond a passing greeting in a corridor. He was seated at the great oak table, with a state map spread before him, a furrow of concentration between his brows, and he looked up at her entrance with an expression of faint surprise, as though he had forgotten the room could hold any occupant but himself. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not know you were here. I shall find another room. There is no need." He gestured, somewhat awkwardly, at the shelves lining the far wall. "The library is large enough, I think, to accommodate us both, without undue disturbance to either party." She chose a volume of poetry at random and settled into a chair by the window, and for the better part of an hour neither of them spoke, though Eleanor found herself, more than once, glancing up to find the Duke's attention had drifted from his ledgers to her own quiet reading, only to return hastily to his maps the instant their eyes threatened to meet. "You read a great deal," he observed at last, breaking a silence that had grown, by slow degrees, from awkward to companionable. "I had little else to occupy my evenings before I came here, Your Grace. Books do not require a fire lit, nor coal to burn, and the parish library was generous in what it would lend a girl with no family name to recommend her." "And what do you make of it? The poem, I mean?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, as though it were the first time in some while that anyone had troubled to ask her honest opinion of anything at all. "I think the poet mistakes longing for love, Your Grace, and grief for wisdom. It is a common enough mistake, I find. But the verses are beautiful regardless of whether the sentiment beneath them holds true." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. "You are a rather more exacting critic than I expected of a lady's companion. I did not know companions were meant to hold their tongues on matters of literature, Your Grace. If it is required, I shall endeavor to learn the skill, though I confess I have never been particularly good at holding my tongue on anything I believe to be true." "Do not learn it on my account," he said, and this time the almost smile reached, however briefly, his eyes. I have had my fill, these past years, of people who tell me only what they believe I wish to hear. Weeks passed, like pages turning slowly in candlelight, each one bringing some new, small intimacy Eleanor had not anticipated and could not quite bring herself to regret. There were mornings in the stables, where the Duke, against every rule of decorum a companion might reasonably have expected to govern her conduct, insisted on teaching her to sit a horse properly, his hands correcting the set of her shoulders with a formality that did not entirely disguise the current running beneath it. There were evenings in the drawing room, where the Dowager Duchess, with the particular shrewdness of the elderly, would retire early, and rather too obviously, leaving her son and his mother's companion to sit in a silence that grew, week by week, less uncomfortable and more charged with something neither of them named aloud. "You are unlike anyone else in this house," he told her one evening in the garden, watching her arrange a handful of wildflowers a housemaid would have discarded as weeds into a small jar of water. "Unlike anyone in any house I have entered, I think, in a good many years. Because I notice what others overlook, Your Grace. Because you make me notice it as well." He said it quietly, almost reluctantly, as though the admission cost him something he had not expected to spend. "I have walked past that particular corner of the garden 1,000 times without once observing that anything grew there worth the noticing." She taught him, in fragments offered over many such evenings, the wisdom Nana Adaeze had given her, that a single hand cannot tie a bundle alone, that the child who is embraced by no one will, in time, burn down the village simply to feel some warmth against the cold, that true wealth is measured not in what a person accumulates, but in what they are willing to set down, freely, for the sake of another. "Your grandmother sounds a remarkable woman," Edward said one such evening. The fire burned low, the Dowager Duchess long since retired. "She was not my true grandmother," Eleanor said, as she always was careful to clarify, though the correction had grown, over the years, more a matter of honesty than of any real distance in her heart. "She took me in when I had no one else in the world to take me. She used to say a family built from choice is no lesser thing than one built from blood, sturdier sometimes for having been chosen rather than merely inherited. I begin to think," he said slowly, watching the firelight rather than her face, as though it were easier to speak the truth to the flames than to the woman herself, "that I inherited a great many things in this life, a title, an estate, a name 6 centuries old, and chose remarkably few of them. And if you were permitted to choose, Your Grace, what would you keep?" He looked at her then, directly, and something passed between them in the quiet, unspoken, forbidden by every rule of rank and propriety that governed both their lives, and entirely undeniable all the same. "I am beginning to have a rather clear notion," he said, "though I do not yet know what to do with it." Neither, in truth, did she. A duke and a shopgirl turned companion belonged, by every law society recognized, to two entirely separate worlds, and Eleanor was not so foolish as to mistake a few stolen evenings by a dying fire for anything the world would sanction. And yet she found, with each week that passed, that she thought of him at odd hours, while reading his mother's letters aloud, while walking alone in the garden he had shown her, while lying awake in the small hours turning over the particular quality of his rare, unguarded smile, with a frequency that frightened her rather more than she cared to admit. If their quiet, careful chemistry is making your heart ache, the good kind of ache, the kind that lingers long after the fire has burned down to embers, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of their story. Lady Beatrice Sinclair had expected, for 2 years running, and with the particular certainty of a woman who had never once in her life been told no, to become the next Duchess of Ashmoor. Their families were old friends, their estates adjoining, and Beatrice had spent the better part of 2 seasons cultivating the Duke's attention with the practiced skill of a woman raised from birth to understand marriage as a transaction of rank and land, executed with grace and without any inconvenient reference to sentiment. That the Duke had never actually proposed, nor given any particular sign of intending to, had troubled her rather less than it might have troubled a woman with less confidence in her own eventual triumph. She arrived at Ashmoor for the spring house party with every expectation of continuing her quiet campaign, and instead found the household, and, more alarmingly, the Duke himself, entirely preoccupied with a companion of no family, no fortune, and no claim whatsoever to the sort of attention Beatrice had spent 2 years carefully securing for herself. "A shop girl," she said to her particular friend, Lady Frances Marsh, over tea taken rather too pointedly in the drawing-room, while Eleanor read to the Dowager Duchess in the next chamber, well within earshot. "Playing companion while she schemes, no doubt. For a coronet she has not the first notion how to wear." "Surely the Duke does not encourage it," Lady Frances said, though her tone suggested she rather thought he did. "The Duke," said Beatrice, with the particular bitterness of a woman watching her carefully laid plans unravel, "has been observed in the stables at 7 in the morning, teaching a companion to ride, when he has not troubled himself to ride with me in 2 full seasons of acquaintance." The rumors began quietly, as such things always do. A word here, a raised eyebrow there, a suggestion dropped into conversation with the careful precision of a woman who understood exactly how gossip traveled through a household and how thoroughly it could ruin a reputation with no fortune to protect it. Whispers that Eleanor had ingratiated herself through calculation rather than kindness, that she had orchestrated the entire encounter with the Dowager Duchess deliberately, having somehow learned in advance of the old woman's habit of walking incognito through London's shops, that she was, beneath her carefully cultivated humility, a fortune hunter of the very lowest and most calculating sort. Eleanor bore the whispers with as much composure as she could manage, though they cost her more than she allowed herself to show. She had faced cruelty before, at Ashworth and Sons, and in the narrow streets of her childhood, and had believed herself hardened against it. She discovered, to her private grief, that whispers carried a good deal further, and cut a good deal deeper, when they threatened not merely her pride, but a happiness she had only just begun, cautiously, to permit herself to feel. Beatrice, watching and waiting with the patience of a woman who had never yet lost anything she was truly determined to keep, understood that whispers alone would not be sufficient. She required, she decided, something rather more conclusive. Ashmoor Castle hosted, each spring, a ball of some local significance, an event the Dowager Duchess had, for the first time in some years, insisted the household prepare for with genuine enthusiasm, and an event to which Eleanor, as the Duchess's companion, found herself unexpectedly and rather nervously included. It was there, amid the candlelight and the swirl of silk and the particular formality of a Victorian ballroom governed by rules Eleanor had only recently begun to learn, that the first true crisis of misunderstanding arrived. Eleanor's cousin, a young solicitor's clerk named Thomas Whitmore, whom she had not seen in some years and had not expected to encounter at so grand an occasion, had in fact been invited quite separately, as the guest of a minor gentry family with whom his employer had business. Overjoyed to discover a familiar face amid so many strangers, and quite unaware of any delicacy the moment might carry, Thomas had crossed the ballroom floor, embraced his cousin warmly, in full view of the assembled company, and held her hands with evident affection while catching up on some years of family news. The Duke, entering the ballroom at that precise moment after some delay in the card-room, observed the scene from across the crowded floor. A strange man holding Eleanor's hands with obvious familiarity, her face turned up to his with open warmth, and felt something cold and entirely unfamiliar close around his chest. He said nothing of it that evening, though his manner toward Eleanor grew, over the following days, noticeably distant, his usual careful attentiveness replaced by a courteous formality that stung her rather more than open coldness might have done. "Have I offended your grace in some way?" she asked at last, unable to bear the change any longer, finding him alone in the library some days after the ball. "I have no notion what you mean," he said, though his eyes did not quite meet hers. "You have scarcely spoken 3 words to me since the ball, and each of those with the particular politeness one reserves for strangers rather than friends. I would rather know plainly what I have done than endure your silence, your grace." He was quiet a long moment, his jaw tight, before the truth came out of him with evident reluctance. "I saw you at the ball, with a gentleman who held your hands as though he had some claim to them." Eleanor, despite the ache of the preceding days, found herself very nearly laughing with relief. "That gentleman, your grace, was my cousin Thomas, my mother's nephew, whom I had not seen in 4 years, and did not expect to find at your ball at all. If I embraced him with warmth, it was because family is a rare enough thing in my life that I do not squander the little of it I possess. The relief that crossed his face was so immediate, so entirely unguarded, that Eleanor understood in that instant precisely how much the misunderstanding had cost him, and precisely how much he had come, without either of them quite acknowledging it aloud, to care. "I have behaved like a jealous fool," he said quietly. "You have behaved," she said, "like a man who has spent so many years guarding his heart against disappointment that he has forgotten how to trust what stands directly in front of him. I do not think that makes you a fool, Your Grace. I think it makes you rather sadder than a fool, and rather more forgivable." Quote. It was the closest either of them had come, in all their weeks of careful evenings and unspoken glances, to naming what had grown quietly between them. Neither pressed the matter further that day. But something had shifted, all the same, and Lady Beatrice Sinclair, observing the renewed warmth between them from across the drawing room in the days that followed, understood that her rival had survived one crisis only to leave herself, unknowingly, rather more vulnerable to the next. The sapphire brooch had belonged to 6 generations of Wexford duchesses, a Wexford family heirloom of considerable value and rather greater sentimental weight, kept always in a locked case within the Dowager Duchess's private chamber and worn only upon the most significant of occasions. It vanished on a Tuesday, discovered missing by the Dowager Duchess's own maid while preparing the case for a formal dinner, and by Wednesday morning, the whole household had been thrown into a state of quiet, anxious speculation as to how so valuable an object could have disappeared from a locked room within a castle full of servants who had, in most cases, served the family for decades without a single accusation of dishonesty ever leveled against them. "It grieves me to suggest it," she said, setting down her fork with evident distaste for the very words she was about to speak. "But who among us, besides the family and the oldest of the servants, has had such ready access to her Grace's private chamber these past weeks? Who else had reason and opportunity, and so very much to gain from a sudden improvement in fortune?" The accusation, once spoken aloud, spread through Ashmoor Castle like fire through dry thatch. Eleanor was summoned the following morning before the Duke, before his mother, before an assembled portion of the household staff who had, only weeks earlier, begun to warm to her company, and now regarded her with the particular wariness reserved for the accused. She stood before them with her chin lifted and her hands folded before her, though her heart, in truth, was breaking with every passing moment of silence. "I did not take it," she said simply. "I have nothing to offer in my own defense but my word, and I understand well enough that my word alone may not be sufficient against the weight of what is being suggested." "Your word," Beatrice repeated, letting the phrase curdle in the air with evident satisfaction, "against a family heirloom missing from a locked chamber to which very few possessed a key." Eleanor looked, in that terrible moment, to the Duke, searching his face for the man who had taught her to sit a horse at dawn, who had listened to her grandmother's proverbs by firelight, who had confessed, only days before, to a jealousy born of caring, rather more than he had intended to reveal, and found instead a guarded, unreadable mask, his jaw set, his eyes carefully fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, rather than upon her face. The weight of his rank pressed upon him visibly, his family's honor, his mother's shaken trust, the assembled judgment of a household watching to see how their Duke would rule, and in that terrible, prolonged silence, he said nothing at all in her defense. His silence was, to Eleanor, its own verdict, more damning than any accusation Beatrice might have spoken aloud. Eleanor left Ashmoor Castle that same night, on foot, in a rain that had begun to fall sometime during the long hours of her disgrace, and showed no sign of relenting, leaving in precisely the manner she had once left Ashworth and Sons, with empty pockets and a heart too proud to beg for a belief that had not been freely given. She walked the first 2 miles before a passing farmer's cart, its driver taking pity on a young woman alone on a dark road in such weather, carried her the remaining distance to the nearest coaching inn, and from there, by a series of slow and increasingly uncomfortable stages, back to London and the small lodging house she had left, it seemed to her now, a lifetime ago. The weeks that followed were among the hardest of her life, harder in some ways than the years following her parents' deaths, for she had at least, in that grief, never doubted her own worth. Now she found herself doubting everything, whether her kindness had ever truly mattered to anyone beyond the moment it was given, whether the weeks at Ashmoor had been anything more than a brief and foolish dream from which she had, at last, been rudely woken, whether a man's silence in the face of accusation could ever truly be forgiven, however dearly she had come, against every sensible caution, to love him. She found work again, eventually, in a milliner's shop far humbler than Ashworth and Sons, and told no one of the weeks she had spent within a castle's walls, for the story, she reasoned, could only invite further mockery from those who would not believe a shopgirl had ever truly dined at a duke's table. A gift given and then doubted is no longer a gift, she whispered to herself some nights, remembering Nana Adaizi's words and adapting them, in her private grief, to a wound her grandmother had never lived to see her suffer, but the withholding of trust once given is a wound no coin and no apology can ever fully mend. She did not know, in those long gray weeks, that Ashmoor Castle without her had become, to its master, a house with its hearth put entirely out. Edward told himself, in the days following Eleanor's departure, that it was propriety alone that had silenced him before the assembled household, that a duke could not be seen to defend a companion against an accusation touching his own family's honor without evidence of her innocence to offer in return, that his silence had been caution rather than betrayal. He told himself a great many things. In fact, in the days that followed, staring at ledgers he found he could no longer read with any comprehension, at chessboards left unfinished, at a corner of the garden where a jar of wildflowers had wilted, untended, upon a windowsill no one had thought to clear away. It was his mother, at last, who broke through the careful architecture of his self-justification. "I have been rich all my life, Edward," the Dowager Duchess said, finding him alone in his study one evening, some 10 days after Eleanor's departure, his correspondence entirely neglected before him. "I have been flattered, courted, and admired by a great many people across 7 decades of living, and I will tell you plainly that I have met, in all that time, perhaps one person who wanted nothing whatsoever from my wealth but the simple chance to be decent to a stranger who appeared to have nothing at all to offer in return. You let a fortnight of doubt speak louder than 2 months of watching that same person's character with your own 2 eyes, and you did it, I think, because it was easier to doubt her than to risk your own heart on the possibility that she was exactly what she appeared to be. You believe her innocent, then?" "I believe," said his mother, "that a girl who gave away her last coin to a beggar she had never met, expecting nothing whatsoever in return, is rather unlikely to have risked everything she had gained for the sake of a brooch she would have had no earthly means of selling without drawing immediate suspicion upon herself. But belief, Edward, is not proof, and if you truly wish to know the truth of the matter, I suggest you stop staring at your ledgers and go and find it." That night, at his mother's urging and his own long-suppressed conviction, Edward ordered the household searched from cellar to attic, not, as the staff initially feared, for further evidence of scandal, but for the truth itself, wherever it might be found. It was a young scullery maid named Alice, terrified and long silent out of fear of Lady Beatrice's temper and her own precarious position within the household, who at last confessed, trembling, to having witnessed Beatrice's own lady's maid conceal the brooch behind a loose stone in the castle's east wall some weeks prior, acting entirely upon her mistress's explicit and carefully worded instruction. The Duke stood alone in his study past midnight, the recovered brooch cold and damning in his own palm, and understood with sudden, devastating clarity precisely what he had traded away for the comfort of appearances and the caution of his rank, the one true, unguarded thing his careful, dutiful life had ever offered him. He could not draw an easy breath until he was in the carriage, driving through the dark toward London, at a pace that had his coachman glancing back in some alarm, toward the small lodging-house where Eleanor had, once again, returned to nothing. He could not live without her. He understood that now, entirely and without reservation, and the understanding frightened him a good deal less than the prospect of losing her a second time through his own silence. She was standing at the wash-line behind the lodging-house, wringing water from a borrowed dress in a light rain that had begun to fall an hour before, when the carriage stopped in the muddy lane, and the Duke of Ashmoor stepped down, without his hat, without his gloves, without a single care for what any neighbor might whisper at the sight of a duke standing bareheaded in a poor London lane. "Eleanor," She turned, startled, wary, her wet hands still gripping the fabric she had been wringing. Your Grace should not be seen here. I no longer care what should or should not be seen, he said, closing the distance between them with quick, unguarded strides, entirely unlike his usual measured gait. I have spent every hour since you left learning precisely what a fool looks like from the inside, and I find the view rather less flattering than I might have hoped. Beatrice hid the brooch herself, through her own maid, weeks ago. I found the truth too late to spare you the pain of the accusation, but not, I pray with everything I possess, too late for anything else that might yet be salvaged between us. Eleanor's composure, so carefully rebuilt across weeks of quiet, private grief, cracked at last, her eyes bright with tears she had refused, until this moment, to allow herself. You let your silence answer for you, Edward, when I stood before that household and needed you to speak. That silence told me exactly where I stood in your regard, whatever tenderness had passed between us in private. Then let me answer now, plainly, so there can be no possible mistaking it. He took her rain-damp hands in his own, heedless of the wet fabric she still held between them. You once told me a closed hand cannot receive a gift. I kept mine closed a fortnight too long, out of pride, out of fear of what the world would say of a duke who had given his heart to a woman it deemed beneath his notice, out of a lifetime's habit of guarding myself against exactly the kind of loss I have now brought entirely upon myself. I open my hand now, Eleanor, before you, without conditions and without further caution. I have nothing left to offer that means more to me than what stands before me in this lane. And if I close mine in return, your Grace, having learned this fortnight past what your silence is worth, then I will stand in this rain until you do not, he said simply, however long that proves to be, and however foolish I appear to every soul who passes this lane in the meantime. She laughed then, a small, disbelieving, entirely unguarded sound, the first true laugh she had permitted herself in weeks, and did not close her hand at all. If this reunion made your heart ache in the very best way, the way only a long-awaited homecoming can, that ache is exactly why we tell these stories, and your subscription helps us bring you more of them. The truth, once fully exposed before the household, and, in time, before rather more of society than Lady Beatrice would have wished, unraveled her position entirely. She departed London within the month, her reputation beyond any easy salvaging, her carefully laid schemes the subject of precisely the sort of whispered drawing-room gossip she had once delighted in setting in motion against someone she had believed powerless to answer it. The wedding, when at last it came, some months later, was held in Ashmoor's ancient chapel, candlelight gilding stone walls that had stood 4 centuries and witnessed, the Dowager Duchess declared with evident satisfaction, nothing lovelier in all that long span of years. Eleanor wore no diamonds borrowed from the Wexford family vault, though Edward had offered her the whole of it without reservation. She wore instead, pinned carefully at her collar above a simple gown of pale gray silk, a small carved wooden pendant, shaped like a bird with its wings spread wide, the only true inheritance Nana Adeze had ever left her, and the only one she had ever truly wanted. "A strange thing to wear upon your wedding day," Edward murmured, admiring it as she walked toward him down the long aisle, past faces both familiar and strange, past servants who had once regarded her with suspicion, and now wept, quite openly, at the sight of her. "It is a reminder, your Grace," Eleanor said, taking his offered hand, "that kindness opens doors no wealth can ever unlock. I should like our children, when they come, to know that truth before they learn anything at all of titles or fortunes or the particular weight of a name 6 centuries old." He took her hand before the assembled peerage of England, before a mother who had, in a jeweler's shop some months before, first glimpsed in a stranger's face the person her own son had needed all along, and found, for the first time in his careful, dutiful life, that he did not have to measure a single word of what he wished to say. "Then let it open every door in this house," he said, "beginning, I think, with mine, which I fear has stood rather too long closed against exactly this kind of grace." Years later, it was said in London's drawing rooms, with a mixture of admiration and mild scandal that never quite faded, that the Duchess of Ashmoor kept an open kitchen at the castle for any traveler who knocked upon her door, regardless of the state of their dress or the thinness of their purse. Few remembered by then that she had once been dismissed from a jeweler's shop on Bond Street for the crime of offering a cup of water to a beggar, but she remembered. And on quiet evenings, with her own children gathered close about her feet before the great hearth that had once, in her darkest weeks, gone entirely cold, she would tell them Nana Adaeze's oldest proverb, the one that had carried her through every hard winter of her life, long before she ever dreamed of castles or dukes or candlelit chapels. Guard your kindness like a flame in the wind, my children. The world will try, again and again, to blow it out. Do not let it, for it is the only light that always finds its way home, no matter how far, nor how hard a road it must travel to arrive there. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel for more unforgettable Duke romances filled with love, mystery, and happily ever afters. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you in the next story.